So, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are going to be talking about the new coaching platform and giving a bit of a demo of it. So, the way that we'll structure it, I'll go through just a small presentation that gives some context to Tymewear, VitalPro, and breathing, and what we can do with it as a training metric and the insights that we're gaining from it. And then I'll switch over and demo some of the new features that we have for the coaching side of things. When we think about measuring training, we have these kind of two broad themes. There's the internal load, and then there's the external load. External, of course, we have pace and power. Internal, we're looking at metabolic carts, lactate, heart rate, as well as the perceived effort, so RPE. Yeah, so here we have the slide showing the internal versus external. These are kind of the main parameters we have to understand what's going on with athletes out in the field. And what we're introducing is a new parameter in addition to the internal load side of things with breathing. And we're really seeing that as a new window into performance, and what we can do with it is what I'm going to be talking about today. This is the product for those that are not familiar. So we have a heart rate sensor on the front and a breathing sensor on the back. We're looking at the expansion and contraction of the chest cavity. That gives us the breathing rate and a relative circumference change, which then maps to tidal volume. That's, of course, not a direct measure of tidal volume, but tends to be pretty good. Multiply those two together, and we get minute ventilation, breathing. So we're really looking at that as a new window into performance in the field. Breathing is interesting because it really has two key inputs. On the one side, it's answering the call of the muscles, how much oxygen is coming in, how much CO2 is going out. This really is, I think the best way to think about this is that the net sum of stuff that needs to go in and out of the muscles must go through the lungs. And so the airflow there, the minute ventilation, is really indicative of what's passing through, how much and how that's changing over time is how we can understand the minute ventilation signal. But it's also, in fact, impacted by stress and the stress and relaxation response. And primarily, that influences the breathing rate response. So as stress increases, breathing rate will be impacted. And if the internal load is not changing, then tidal volume will compensate for that by reducing in order to make sure that we're not hyperventilating. And so it matches with the increasing breathing rate by reducing tidal volume, thereby kind of giving us a twofer, one in insight into the internal load and the other an insight into any increases in stress response. This is how the signal gets processed. We have the peaks, that's the breathing rate, and the expansion there is the tidal volume. Minute ventilation, internal load, breathing rate, perceived exertion. That's kind of the TLDR of how we understand and use the breathing signal. Underlying the muscle side of things is really the substrate utilization that drives the CO2 response that then drives the minute ventilation response. So as we transition from predominantly fat utilization over to carb utilization, the thing that's really happening there that's driving the ventilation response is an increasing output of CO2 as a result of increased carbohydrate utilization. And so that is how we can assess the ventilation response to get an indication of what's actually going on underneath the hood. That gives us a way to assess VT1 and VT2 from how ventilation is, the inflection points in the ventilation curve are responding to increasing intensity. So this is kind of the standard stuff here, but really I think the important thing to understand is that the driving force during exercise is really on that CO2 component that is driving that ventilation response, and that's why we expose the thresholds, and that's how the thresholds get exposed in that signal. We can take that and measure that from athletes, and usually from a traditional ramp test. We take the max from that test in terms of the power or the pace. We translate that, nothing fancy, over to VO2 max with formulas. We're not measuring VO2 max, but it's effectively a max aerobic power assessment that then gets translated over to VO2 max. The key thing is that we're measuring the inflection points of VT1 and VT2. That gives us then the relative markers of where VT1 is compared to that MAP or that max aerobic power. And that's really where some interesting things starts to come to light in terms of the individual response and where someone may have room to improve versus where they might have diminishing returns. And that's kind of where the rubber starts to meet the road in terms of coaching features. So here we can start to offer a way to measure athletes and assess VT1 and VT2, fairly easy way, wherever the athlete might be. And that starts to create a foundation on which we can build training programs, understanding where their low-hanging fruit are, where their diminishing returns might be from a physiological standpoint. And then, of course, layering in all the other, emphases and I guess non-physiological parameters like race distance and scenarios that arise as you're preparing for a certain race or event. But this at least gives that sort of individual physiological foundation on which to build those plans. And that's kind of the work that we've been working on now is how to automate much of that work in order to create a foundation on which to then build and further customize to each individual, making this more accessible. There are some nice papers that have been coming out, especially around how ventilation can not only be used for assessing VT1 and VT2, but as a real-time guide. So similar to how we prescribe in heart rate or prescribe in power in terms of a number that you chase during a workout, there's been some evidence to show that ventilation, so the airflow in and out, is a useful one to use for certain workouts in terms of targeting an internal state. So here's some nice research that was done down in New Zealand. They were looking at durability, and what they found was that they tested VT1 before. They did a 2-hour fatiguing session at VT1 power that was assessed in that first VT1 assessment. And then they tested VT1 again. This is the average of those results. So generally, fatigue caused power to drop at the VT1 in the post assessment. Heart rate had increased about 9 beats at the VT1. Ventilation has a large operating range. 3 liters per minute is a drop in the bucket. So here we have some evidence to show that if we're, for example, doing zone 2, quote unquote, zone 2 work or VT1 work, ventilation might actually be a superior measure to prescribe to in order to keep the internal state for that adaptation that we're trying to create at that level. There have been other things on the perceived exertion side where this is across multiple different sports and modalities where they're linking the increase in breathing rate with the increase in perceived exertion. This is an interesting one. If the first part is true and we have a way to measure internal load, and the second part is true, then we kind of have this one signal that gives us an internal measure of the internal state and how someone perceives their effort to be, how stressed they might be perceiving the effort to be. So to give some context to that, so starting to dig into how this actually looks from a data perspective. Here we have worldview, we have power or an external measure, and we have heart rate, that sort of internal measure that we've had for decades. And here we have a 30-30 workout on a bike. We're going up to about 100% of max aerobic power. And the heart rate you see there is responding in a certain way, right? So it's rising in that first set, and then it kind of starts to plateau in the second and has pretty much plateaued to slightly decreasing in the last set. So if this is all the data and information we have, then we would assume that the person is really settling in here in that second set. Nothing much is changing from here until the end, and possibly even getting a little bit, dropping a little bit at the end. But when we layer in breathing rate, we get a very different image. So we see breathing rate here in the white is pretty much consistently increasing from start to finish, reaching the max at the end. What this is really showing is that things get progressively harder and harder. Breathing and heart rate tends to saturate to the oxygen demand, but does not really tell us about what the perceived effort is, or if the internal state is actually rising relative to the efficiency of that output. So as the fatigue increases, our perception of the effort increases. Also, our internal effort can increase as we become less efficient due to the fatigue. Here's just one image of how breathing rate, we can start to use it in our analysis to understand something deeper about the athlete than what we had before, kind of another window into how they're actually performing. And another thing to point out here is what I personally really like to look at is the pre and post breathing rate response. So if you see the blue line here at the beginning and the end, they're quite similar power outputs, but then the breathing response is quite different. The heart rate response is quite different. But you'll see, and I'll have some examples later where this is not always the case. And so they can be telling conflicting stories in terms of why is the heart rate elevated versus now we have the breathing rate showing us that there's an elevation of stress at the end relative to the beginning. This is something that can then become barometer, if you will, of how stressful was this work for this athlete. Eventually could be used into something that is feeding back into the loop of we have measures like TSS and things like that. We could start to argue that these metrics start to form a measurable TSS or a physiological TSS. That's kind of exciting. Here's another example now on the running side. Here we have a backyard ultra. What we're looking at here is the average of each lap. Every lap, I believe, was something on the order of 8 kilometers. What you see here is averages the heart rate for the lap and the pace and the speed. They're both decreasing the entire time. And so again, if this is the only information that we have about performance of this backyard ultra, we would think that the intensity and the output is actually decreasing over time. When we add in the breathing rate response, now we're looking at the heart rate percentage of heart rate reserve versus the percentage of breathing rate reserve. Breathing rate is steadily increasing, which is mapping onto the stress of completing one lap after the next. So while heart rate is actually decreasing, breathing rate is increasing. The RPE was reported along with this and mapped onto. And if anyone has ever done this, you basically tap out at the one that you do last. And so that was the last one he was able to complete. So we're getting a fundamentally different picture here when we have breathing rate in the loop. What it's telling us is that it's getting harder and harder, whereas with the heart rate, it was supposedly getting easier and easier in terms of the output. When we add in the overall breathing picture, then we can start to look at the VE or the minute ventilation and how then the tidal volume is also responding against the rising breathing rate. He went out fast in that first one, and so we have a high VE for that one. He settled in, sort of saw his error, and settled into the race in the second one, and pretty much evenly paced it from an internal standpoint for the rest of the race. If we go back to the speed was decreasing. So this now again comes back and attaches to the insights that they were seeing down in New Zealand with the durability, is that the internal state was staying the same, but the pace was dropping, right? And we can expect to, we have some evidence to show that is actually what is happening, is that the effective output, the external load at the internal effort, same internal effort, is actually decreasing due to the fatigue. And so here we have an assessment as ventilation is staying consistent, speed is going down. We can basically make, assess that as an effective decrease in the effective output. So breathing rate's increasing as RP is increasing, and because the internal load is staying consistent, tidal volume is dropping as a result. And this is creating a kind of a mapping or matching of the stress response to the internal state. We're going to take a look. This is the roster here. So this is the view the coaches would have. You can add an athlete, invite them, and they can accept, and then they will populate here for you. You can enter then in their dashboard. And here we see a continental rider. This is the result of his latest test taken just under a week ago. You can see this guy is quite fit, so it's always fun to see this kind of data. What we have here is the overview. So VT1, VT2, these are the measured parameters, and we have a VO2 that you'll see here. This is really just the direct translation from the power. And we put this here just because it gives context. People kind of, relate to this, especially if they're used to sending in for tests and so forth. This is not a direct measurement. That's super important to just be very clear about. This is the measurement, so the power output at the VT1 detection. We have the heart rate, and we have the ventilation. These percentages down here are the relative percentages of the max. So here we have 67% of the max, 78% for VT1 of the max, and so on. So this then creates the fitness profile. The VO2 max, there are some really nice papers that have been able to translate VO2 max over to a requisite energy expenditure for that fitness level. So that's pretty much what we're doing here. And what we find is that it's quite consistent. So if you have a coached athlete, they'll usually be in the ballpark. It's not exact, and it's obviously not going to be 100%, but it's going to be in the ballpark of where they're actually training. And so for this guy, it's around 13,000 kcals. Based on how the thresholds then present, what we can then do is we can create a training recommendation that is a split by zone. Think of this as zone one and zone two. It's just a function of this early dashboard that zone one can't really properly be factored into this. So we're just showing it as zone two, but really this is zone one and zone two with VT1 here in splitting the difference between zone two and zone three. So based on how these thresholds present, we can then divvy up the recommended kcals between the places where there would be room to improve. And so this guy's getting a lot of base and some high end, but not a lot. We can dig into the test itself. So if we click into it, you can see that this was actually outside. So this guy is on a mountain somewhere. We have the detections for the thresholds. These are pinned and generate then the associated metrics and all the table that we have here. If we go below, this is a view that I really like to use. So you have heart rate on the x-axis and ventilation on the y. You can see it here too. Heart rate is generally increasing linearly, and ventilation has this kind of slow response and then really starts to ramp up. And when you combine these two signals and you're looking at the heart rate relative to the ventilation, you really see that kind of exposed nicely. The coloring that we're seeing here is actually a breath by breath model. And this is something that we are working on introducing. So this is completely independent of any kind of manual checks or tests or assessments. This is just a model that has been taught based on all the tests that we've been receiving and in the workouts, subsequent workouts. We're basically teaching it how to recognize how breathing responds below VT1, between VT1 and VT2, and above VT2. And this is a version of that model. We have a new version coming out pretty soon, but this is all just admin stuff for now, and we'll slowly start to release this as we get confidence. But here you can see the transitions between the zones. So it's predicting that VT1 is in this range here as the blue transitions to yellow. That's your kind of zone 2 to zone 3 transition. It thinks VT2 is transitioning here. This is actually quite nice. Here it's underestimating it slightly. VT1 is probably closer to this than to this. So it's a bit it's not getting it exactly, but it's doing a pretty good job of that. This view here I like as just a representation of the volume. So here we have the zone colors, and then this is the ventilation and time spent at any given ventilation. When you have something that goes into high intensity, you get this long tail, and that's because ventilation is so non-linear. As you get into these ranges here, you get this long tail and this sort of bulk where the easy stuff is happening, and this long tail where the hard stuff is happening. This is all based on the ventilation response and where we now know the thresholds and zone delineations to be. That gives us a time and zone. So for every zone 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get time and zone, and we translate that also into kcals, and we get a total kcal number, total time, and then the percentage is spent and so forth. We can go down and we just get an overview of this athlete's training, hours in the last 30 days, number of activities, total kcals. And here we have first pass representation of overall calories spent on a daily basis versus where that is roughly being spent. Here we're seeing how much is spent in zone 2 versus zone 4 and 5. So we can see this guy is spending a lot of time in base. And I think here it was all just zone 1, and that's why it's not even being presented. Activity map, just getting a sense, high-level overview where the kcals are being attributed throughout this timeline, activity graph. And then here we just have, if you're using, for example, training peaks or anything here, it's just really easy to kind of copy paste any values over to another system. So that's kind of the intention here. Here we have the profile of this user. What we're looking at here is setting the resting and the max values. This can either be automatically pulled from workouts and or threshold tests or manually input so that you can create what are known as the reserves for breathing rate, heart rate, and ventilation. So here's some of the things that we can start to do. Here's an easy zone 1 type ride for this individual. We have all the plots or the data that's available here. And we can start to look at, for example, VE reserve, nice and stable. And we can create segments. So here I've already created 2, but really all you really need to do is just highlight and save. that then saves the associated metrics with each of these. So again, this is kind of an easy type of a ride, and we can start to look at how things might be changing over time. So here he's outputting 240 versus 236 in the first hour versus the last hour. Ventilation rises about 5%. Not crazy, but it's still a bit of a rise. And we can start to look at what the other signals are telling us. So, for example, breathing rate. Here we're seeing 4 or 5% increase. Heart rate, we're seeing about a 3% increase, which is very, very little. So a bit of an increase in the ventilation and breathing rate. Heart rate's pretty stable, power is pretty stable. This is an easy ride. And we can see here time spent is almost all in zone 1, fades a little bit into the bottom half of zone 2, but this is a pretty controlled, easy ride. We can look at it again, the heart rate versus the ventilation, and we can compare it to the test that he did. So here we see this is the data from this easy ride, and you see it's lining up quite nicely with the lower end of his test. So this is where we would expect an easy ride to land. Low heart rate, low ventilation, stable ventilation. And we can even do the zone overlay again, and it just kind of tells us where it thinks the transitions are and so forth. So we saw some amount of shift here, and I want to just kind of emphasize the sensitivity of this. So here we had a base endurance, relatively easy, and we had about a 4% shift. Here we have some VT1 intervals. So this is 7 by 20 minutes at VT1, 4 hours workout, and we're starting to see a bigger shift. Heart rate, interestingly, is shifting less, but breathing rate here is shifting 8% for the same power pre and post. So we're starting to build up some more fatigue, and that's kind of what we're measuring here. We go forward into a VT2 workout. So here we see the intervals here at VT2. If we compare in the warm-up period versus the last 2 hours, the breathing rate reserve shift is now at 10%, 11%. We have a VO2 max workout with a lot of intervals in between. We compare again, kind of pre and post. We again see this sort of 10-11% shift. And so we see now this kind of spectrum, and this is just looking at the breathing rate as something that we can start to understand the stress that was caused as something that changes relatively little in easier workouts, but still have duration, and so that might be introducing some amount of stress. As you increase either duration or intensity, you start to build up more and more stress response. And we can also look at, for example, the differences between these VO2 sessions. So here we see the first to the second response. So you see breathing rate here is rising, recovers, rises. And we can sort of map out that response from the first to the second. So heart rate's increasing 2%, breathing rate's up almost 18%, then it goes up 22%, and then almost 30%. And that kind of repeats. So then it recovers back 20%, 26%, and so on. This is a nice way to just see the progression of the stress and the changes that are being introduced there, perceived effort, and then the internal load you can also see is not static. So he's hitting extremely consistent powers, but the ventilation is absorbed quite nicely here in the first two, and then really starts to rise, starts at a higher level here, and so forth. So it's really giving us this sort of a different look at, it's not just you can kind of see the heart rate stabilizing over time, even here and here, whereas the ventilation is having a more dynamic response. And that's kind of just the thing that I want to imbibe on this. And then you can see how consistent that response is. So here, for example, here again, we have the threshold test that this individual took. And here we have the response from this VO2 max session that they did. And so the easy is really mapping really nice to the easy. As it gets harder and harder, that ventilation and heart rate response really starts to map together nicely. Just to kind of get the lay of the land in terms of the data analysis and what can be done. Here you see that long tail again, just to kind of give people reference for how to kind of view this data, is that as you get into those sort of higher order intensities, you'll see that long tail time spent at VE, whereas you'll see more of a clustering where it's more stable and so forth. And then of course you can see all the time spent here, duration and kcals. So that's analysis side of things. And there are some things that we're starting to work on that will automate this to some extent to kind of surface kind of a stress analysis, auto detection of certain segments that can be compared pre and post, so that we can surface on the dashboard or in a kind of a coach's view, takes a workout and surfaces this is what we think the stress level, for example, of this workout was. And that would be then mostly based on something that would, for example, compare these types of segments, the sort of pre and post, what was the work that was achieved in between? Because fundamentally, I think what we want to be able to create over time is a shift in these parameters, either more work for the same shift or same work for a lesser shift. There's a whole range of things that we can really start to dig into this and start to understand progression and fitness improvement and durability and so forth now that we kind of have this data set to play with. So the last thing here is how we're thinking about the prescription workout side of things. So we've created a workout library. It's quite generic. Once we have this foundation, which is kind of that fitness profile, we can then start to map that to workouts within some parameters. So here we have another, he's a triathlete. We have his threshold for running and cycling separately here, and the thresholds, weekly time spent. So thresholds here, fitness profile, training recommendation based on the fitness profile. And we have then that separate for the run and the bike. And then we can go into, this is the kind of a beta version of this, where we take that sort of top line number for this individual. That gives us total hours based on where they would be spending their time, how long it would take them to accumulate roughly the numbers of sort of overall training load. We have a parameter here that is how many workouts per week and how many rest days. And that can then automatically create a day or a week or a month of plans to accommodate that. And it'll be initially fed based on where they sit physiologically. So where the system thinks from a physiological standpoint, where should they be spending their time, which could also obviously be completely opposite to where they should be spending their time for a given race, etc. So again, this is really a foundation on which it's like built on the fitness profile, but then the tools we want to create are then to create a way for coaches to then manipulate this in an easy way in order to meet the goals of the athlete. And so here we have just some start of this, where we have some configurations that we're starting to implement for triathletes or bike run ratio. You kind of shift this around. You can set certain parameters like multiple workout days, rest days, plan length. So you have these sort of like at your disposal to start to play around with. And that will then configure. The idea is that we can have this sort of open-ended as like a simulator that can either be 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, 2 months. And then the main goal here is to then surface, making the sort of the ebbing and flowing of how these change based on demands or time commitments, etc. Those are the tools that we want to be able to create for coaches to easily manipulate this and then track the progress as they do threshold tests, as we start to surface the automated threshold detection from workouts. That will then get populated here based on any changes on that are noticed in the data. That's kind of the vision for this, basically. So we kind of have a one-stop shop that we can really understand from a physiological standpoint where they are, create a foundation, and then nice tools to make it easy to manipulate the training based on goals and time commitments and so forth. Thank you all for joining. Really appreciate your time.